Grizzly bear attacks are among the most harrowing wildlife encounters ever recorded. These massive predators can unleash devastating force in mere seconds, leaving victims with little time to react. In this video, we'll explore 6 chilling tales of bear attacks on humans, from a rampaging grizzly in a Russian jet hangar to a deadly ambush in the Montana wilderness. Join us as we uncover the terrifying realities of these encounters and the lessons learned from those who survived or didn't. The remote airstrip near Komsomolsk-on-Amur in Russia's far eastern Khabarovsk region had seen better days. Originally constructed in the 1970s during the Soviet era to support logging operations, the facility now catered mainly to wealthy businessmen and government officials who relied on private air travel to navigate the vast Siberian wilderness. The hangar, made of aging concrete and corrugated steel, stood approximately 2 kilometers from the main runway. It was surrounded on all sides by dense taiga forest that stretched seemingly without end toward the Chinese border. By April 2023, an unusually harsh winter had given way to a brutally dry spring. The extended drought devastated the local ecosystem, leaving rivers low, vegetation sparse, and wildlife increasingly desperate. Animals that typically avoided human activity were venturing closer to settlements in search of food and water. Local authorities issued multiple advisories about increased bear activity. But the isolated nature of the airstrip meant those warnings were often ignored or underestimated by personnel stationed there. One of them was Dmitry Volkov, a seasoned aircraft mechanic with more than 2 decades of experience. On that particular morning, he arrived at the hangar around 4:30 a.m. to perform routine maintenance on a mid-size private jet owned by a high-ranking business executive from the Pacific Coast. The executive had arranged for a 7 a.m. departure to the capital, giving Dmitry just enough time to complete an inspection and refuel the aircraft before takeoff. Traveling with the executive were 2 associates, his personal assistant and a contracted security advisor. The trio had stayed the night at a nearby hotel, finalizing negotiations for new investments in the region's mineral extraction industry. By 5 a.m., they had arrived at the hangar, where they found Dmitry already working beneath one of the aircraft's wings. The structure itself had long suffered from neglect. Cracks lined the eastern wall, and one section near the auxiliary storage area had begun separating from its foundation. Though maintenance requests had been submitted over the years, budget constraints and the site's remoteness meant proper repairs were always deferred. That weakness would soon prove catastrophic. Shortly after 5:15 a.m., a large Russian brown bear, later estimated to weigh nearly 400 kilograms, approached the facility. The animal had likely been wandering the forest for days, unable to find consistent food sources. Attracted by the scent of packaged goods routinely stored in the hangar for crew use, the bear pressed toward the entrance. The weakened doorframe offered little resistance. With a single powerful shove, the metal buckled inward, and the bear forced its way inside. The people inside were unprepared for what followed. Dmitry, still lying on a creeper beneath the fuselage, heard the metallic groan and assumed someone was trying to enter unauthorized. When he slid out to check, he was met with the sight of the massive bear standing in the doorway. He froze, hoping not to attract attention. The bear, agitated by hunger and the confined environment, advanced rapidly across the hangar floor, claws scraping against concrete as it hunted for the source of the scent. The strongest smell came from a folding table where the executive had been reviewing travel documents. Trapped in the narrow space, he attempted to back away, but the bear lunged with violent speed. A blow from its forelimbs knocked him down before a fatal bite tore into his upper torso. The assistant, nearby and handling paperwork, panicked at the sight. Her sudden movements triggered further aggression from the animal. As she bolted for the hangar's main doors, the bear gave chase. Within moments, it overtook her, and she too was brought down. The security advisor, trained for emergencies, reached for his sidearm but lacked the space to draw and aim effectively. The bear charged a third time, slamming into him before he could regain his footing. Despite his training, the environment offered no advantage. He was overwhelmed. Dmitri, meanwhile, had managed to roll behind a nearby tool cabinet. He stayed hidden, scarcely daring to breathe, as the horrifying sequence unfolded just meters away. He would later describe the sensation of time stretching unnaturally during the event. Mere minutes etched into his memory with agonizing clarity. The sounds of the attack, screams, growls, the crash of falling equipment, echoed across the facility. Security personnel in nearby quarters heard the disturbance and approached the hangar with caution. 3 guards, each armed with standard-issue rifles, advanced on the damaged entrance and peered inside. What they saw was nightmarish. The bear pacing among the victims, its fur matted with blood. Uncertain of how to proceed without provoking another charge, the guards waited. The bear showed no sign of leaving. After nearly 20 tense minutes, the senior guard gave the order to open fire. Multiple rounds were discharged in quick succession. The bear collapsed near the back of the hangar. Medical personnel arrived on site about 40 minutes after the first signs of trouble. All 3 victims had succumbed to their injuries. The tragedy triggered an immediate review of safety protocols at similar remote aviation facilities. In the weeks that followed, officials announced a series of improvements, including stronger structural reinforcements, upgraded fencing, and better wildlife monitoring systems. Though the remote forest eventually reclaimed its silence, the lessons learned from that morning left a lasting imprint across the region. The waters surrounding Kodiak Island in Alaska had long drawn commercial fishermen, but few fully understood the risks posed by the island's most formidable residents. Situated in the Gulf of Alaska, this remote landmass was home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America. Kodiak bears, with some individuals weighing over 600 kilograms, had developed an intricate dependence on the island's salmon runs and coastal ecosystems. By September 2019, the fishing season was approaching its peak. Independent operators were rushing to make their final runs before winter conditions rendered the waters too hazardous. The island's rugged coastline, marked by rocky outcroppings and concealed inlets, offered bountiful fishing grounds, but also posed dangers for those unfamiliar with the patterns and behaviors of local wildlife. Eli Dawson, a 34-year-old fisherman based in Anchorage, had been navigating the waters around Kodiak Island for nearly 8 years. He operated a small aluminum boat, only 14 feet in length, which was ideal for maneuvering through shallow bays where salmon gathered before spawning. Eli had earned a solid reputation among local fishers for his knack at locating productive, lesser-known fishing spots. On one particular morning, Eli chose to work alone in a secluded inlet roughly 6 kilometers south of the main harbor. The location was known for its exceptional salmon runs, but it also bordered a stretch of coastline where bears frequently foraged. While Eli had encountered bears in the past during his work, those moments had been brief and without incident. A friend and fellow fisherman, Ash Kowalski, operated a larger vessel and had agreed to fish in the same general area that day. The two often coordinated, sharing details on fish movements and weather patterns. Ash anchored his boat approximately 400 meters offshore, giving both men space to work efficiently without interfering with each other's operations. The day began uneventfully. Eli cast his nets in the calm inlet, quickly hauling in a substantial catch. The scent of fresh fish soon began wafting inland. Unbeknownst to Eli, it would attract an unwelcome visitor from the nearby shoreline. A massive Kodiak bear, estimated to weigh around 550 kilograms, had been following the smell of fish along the rocky coast. The animal had spent recent days scavenging salmon carcasses left behind by earlier spawning runs. However, the abundance of fresh fish in Eli's nets proved too tempting to ignore. The bear stepped into the shallow water, moving with a deceptive fluidity for its size. Eli noticed the bear when it was about 50 meters from his boat. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, he attempted to stay calm and began maneuvering his vessel away from the shoreline, following standard safety protocols. But the bear seemed fixated on the fish and displayed no intention of retreating. Without warning, the bear surged forward through the water. One massive paw struck the aluminum boat with tremendous force, sending it rocking violently. Eli fought to maintain his balance as the boat tilted, the cold waters threatening to pull him in. A second swipe was even more destructive. The bear's claws raked across the hull, striking the gunwale and capsizing the lightweight craft. Eli was thrown into the frigid September water. The boat flipped over, trapping Eli beneath its hull. An air pocket formed, allowing him to breathe, but his movement was restricted. The water, only 8 degrees Celsius, began draining his body heat immediately. Within minutes, hypothermia became a critical threat. Meanwhile, the bear, agitated by the commotion and persistent in its search for food, circled the overturned boat. Its claws scraped the aluminum as it attempted to reach whatever was inside. Trapped beneath, Eli could hear the animal's heavy breathing and low growls as it probed the hull from above. Realizing his life depended on escaping, Eli retrieved a small knife from his tackle box and began cutting into the underside of the boat. He worked rapidly, creating holes in the thin metal in hopes of forming an exit. Surfacing too soon, while the bear was still investigating, could be fatal. Out at sea, Ash had been observing the situation unfold from his larger vessel. He saw the bear's initial approach and the capsize that followed. Acting quickly, he began sounding his horn repeatedly and shouting to draw the bear's attention away from the overturned boat. The commotion seemed to confuse the animal, briefly halting its investigation. With the bear distracted, Eli forced his way through the weakened hull. He surfaced with a gasp, taking in cold air as he began swimming for the shoreline. The freezing water had already begun affecting his coordination, making his strokes sluggish and uneven. The bear hesitated upon seeing Eli resurface. Ash continued creating noise and maneuvered his vessel closer, remaining at a safe distance but doing everything possible to divert the animal's focus. The bear lingered, torn between retreat and pursuit. Eli reached the rocky shore, pulling himself up the embankment with difficulty. His body was already battered. Deep lacerations from the earlier attack, combined with a fractured rib likely sustained during the capsize, made movement painful. He crawled to a safer position while the bear observed him from a distance. After several tense minutes, the bear finally turned away and vanished into the forest beyond the shore. Eli remained still, ensuring it was truly gone before attempting to move further inland. Later, medical personnel at a local clinic treated Eli's injuries. Thanks to the prompt distraction efforts by Ash and Eli's own quick thinking, he made a full recovery within a few weeks. Officials from the Regional Wildlife Agency later conducted an investigation in the area and discovered several illegal fishing traps near the inlet. These unregulated installations were believed to have disrupted the natural feeding patterns of the local bear population, potentially contributing to the unusually bold behavior exhibited during the encounter. The mountainous region of northwestern Montana, home to one of the country's most well-known parks, had long been recognized as prime grizzly bear habitat. Yet the wilderness areas outside the park's formal boundaries posed even greater challenges for outdoor enthusiasts. These unregulated lands, while offering breathtaking hiking and camping opportunities, lacked the structured wildlife management found within the park system. In August 2021, late summer brought ideal conditions for backcountry camping. The weather was warm and dry, wildfire activity remained low, and the year's abundant huckleberry crop had drawn large numbers of grizzly bears to higher elevations in preparation for hibernation. This convergence of favorable weather and active wildlife created a heightened likelihood of human-wildlife encounters across the region. Jake Thompson, a 29-year-old software engineer from Seattle, had planned a solo camping trip to disconnect from the pressures of his fast-paced career. With more than a decade of hiking and backcountry experience, he had carefully mapped out his 5-day route, applied for the necessary permits, and packed accordingly for a remote journey into the wilderness. His selected campsite was located approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest trailhead, set in a quiet alpine meadow ringed by dense stands of lodgepole pine. The spot offered sweeping views of surrounding peaks and easy access to a freshwater stream for drinking and cooking. Jake had followed standard bear safety procedures when selecting the site, choosing a location that was at least 200 meters away from any obvious game trails or bear travel corridors. Despite his experience and preparation, Jake made one critical mistake, one that would nearly cost him his life. After finishing his evening meal, he chose to store his remaining food supplies inside his tent, rather than placing them in a designated bear-resistant container. The decision was based largely on convenience, as he intended to access his breakfast quickly the next morning, without needing to walk far from camp. Unbeknownst to him, a mature female grizzly, estimated to weigh around 180 kilograms, had been foraging in the same area. Drawn by the scent of ripe huckleberries and seeking additional protein sources, the bear had been active in the region for several days. Her acute sense of smell picked up the strong food odor from Jake's campsite, and she began closing in from a distance. At around 3:30 a.m., Jake was startled awake by a series of scratching sounds just outside his tent. At first, he assumed the noises were caused by a smaller animal, perhaps a raccoon or porcupine, investigating the scent of his meal. He stayed still, hoping the animal would lose interest and wander off. But the scratching intensified. Soon it was accompanied by heavy breathing and low grunting noises that left little doubt. The visitor was not a small mammal, but a much larger predator. Jake quickly realized that a grizzly bear was outside his tent, actively investigating the area. Though Jake had trained for bear encounters and knew the proper response, the vulnerability of his position inside a nylon tent made the situation uniquely perilous. There was no safe way to escape, and the bear showed no signs of simply moving on. Within seconds, the grizzly tore through the rainfly with a single swipe, opening a gaping hole in the tent and exposing the interior. The bear initially focused on the food near Jake's sleeping bag, but his startled movement shifted its attention. What had begun as food-seeking behavior quickly escalated into a direct threat. Jake instinctively rolled onto his stomach, covering his neck with his hands, a widely recommended tactic for surviving a grizzly encounter. He remained motionless, hoping that the bear would focus solely on the food and leave him unharmed. However, the intensity of the food odors and the confined space made retreat unlikely. The bear's claws slashed across Jake's upper back and arm, inflicting deep wounds that would later require surgical intervention. The pain was immediate and severe, but Jake resisted the urge to cry out, fearing any reaction would provoke further aggression. When the bear showed no signs of leaving, Jake shifted tactics. Abandoning the passive defense, he reached for a nearby metal camping stove and swung it toward the bear's face with all the force he could manage. The impact struck the animal on the snout, stunning it briefly. Taking advantage of the momentary pause, Jake began yelling as loudly as he could, using his voice to create chaos and confusion. The combination of resistance and loud noise appeared to disorient the bear, which hesitated, reared back slightly, and then slowly turned away. After several agonizing minutes, the grizzly finally disappeared into the forest. Jake, though bleeding heavily, remained still for several more moments to ensure the bear had truly left. The attack, which had lasted about 8 minutes, had left him physically and emotionally drained. Fortunately, Jake had brought along a personal emergency beacon. Once the danger had passed, he activated the device, which sent a distress signal via GPS to nearby search and rescue teams. The beacon proved invaluable in shortening response time in an area where cell reception was non-existent. A helicopter crew reached Jake's location within 2 hours. On-site paramedics administered emergency care for multiple deep lacerations to his shoulder and arm, as well as several puncture wounds and substantial blood loss. He was flown out of the wilderness and transported to a regional hospital for surgery and recovery. The incident prompted renewed awareness among outdoor enthusiasts and regional agencies regarding the importance of proper food storage, particularly in bear country. Wildlife officials used Jake's experience to illustrate how even highly skilled and prepared individuals could make decisions, sometimes small ones, that carried major consequences. Jake's recovery took several weeks, involving both medical treatment and physical rehabilitation. In interviews afterward, he reflected that the incident had not shaken his passion for wilderness exploration, but it had fundamentally changed his approach to safety. He emphasized that a single lapse in judgment, especially when it comes to food storage, could escalate into a life-threatening situation. The Beaufort Sea, spanning the northern coasts of Alaska and Canada, represented one of the harshest environments for scientific research on Earth. This remote section of the Arctic Ocean had become a focal point for observing the dramatic effects of climate change, where shifting sea ice patterns and vanishing hunting grounds were creating profound disruptions in the local ecosystem, particularly for polar bears. In March 2018, a multinational team of climate scientists established a temporary research station on what appeared to be stable pack ice approximately 200 kilometers north of the Alaskan coastline. The ice floe, roughly 500 meters across, had been selected for its apparent stability and proximity to areas critical for collecting data on ice melt and temperature changes. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, a glaciologist affiliated with a northern U.S. university, led the 5-person expedition. The team included Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist studying Arctic ecosystems, Dr. Pavel Novak, a meteorologist focused on atmospheric data, and 2 graduate students, Thomas Wright and Lisa Martinez, who were collecting material for their doctoral research. For 6 days, the team operated under grueling conditions, carefully monitoring environmental variables while enduring frigid temperatures and mechanical issues. Equipment began to fail due to the extreme cold, and communication with the mainland had become increasingly unreliable. What the team had not yet realized was that the ice floe beneath them had fractured from the larger ice sheet during a storm 2 days earlier. They were now adrift, slowly drifting eastward on a shrinking platform as warmer waters beneath the surface accelerated the floe's degradation. The polar bear that would soon endanger their lives was a mature male, estimated to weigh over 400 kilograms. Climate disruptions had severely impacted the bear's access to seals, its primary prey. With stable sea ice diminishing rapidly each season, many polar bears were now left to roam across increasingly unstable ice, searching for alternate food sources. On the morning of March 15th, Dr. Kellerman spotted a distant figure on the horizon, a pale speck moving slowly across the ice. At first, the team reacted with excitement. Sighting a polar bear in the wild had become increasingly rare in the region, but their fascination turned to apprehension as the animal continued its steady advance, heading directly toward their camp. Its approach was deliberate, not curious but purposeful. It had clearly detected the scent of humans and was investigating. Unlike some other bear species, polar bears often exhibited no natural fear of people and were known to actively pursue humans when hungry. As the bear drew closer, the team enacted their standard safety procedures. They gathered their most critical gear and retreated into the largest shelter, a reinforced Arctic-rated tent designed for extreme conditions. Dr. Chen activated their emergency beacon, hoping the distress signal would reach rescue teams despite their isolation. For nearly 3 hours, the bear patrolled the perimeter of the camp. Occasionally, it would approach the tent, sniffing and pawing at the equipment. Observers inside later described the animal as highly focused, testing defenses and seeking an opportunity. As evening set in, the bear's behavior became more aggressive. Having gone without food for a prolonged period, the scent of humans offered a possible solution to its hunger. It began pawing the fabric of the tent, pressing against the sides with growing intensity. Dr. Novak, who had been recording atmospheric readings from inside, inadvertently brushed against the inner wall of the tent. That minor disturbance drew immediate attention. The bear lunged, biting through the reinforced material and latching its jaws onto Novak's leg. The bite crushed his tibia and fibula instantly, and Novak cried out in pain. The bear attempted to drag him from the tent, lifting much of his body weight off the ground. Its massive strength made resisting nearly impossible. The rest of the team reacted immediately. Dr. Kellerman struck the bear across the snout with a metal equipment case, while the graduate students hurled whatever objects they could find, flares, containers, packs, in a desperate attempt to force the bear to release their colleague. Their coordinated assault eventually worked. The bear dropped Novak, but remained just outside the tent, pacing in the darkness and swiping at gear strewn across the ice. Inside, Novak had managed to crawl back toward the center of the shelter. His teammates quickly applied pressure bandages to his shredded leg. The injuries were severe, compound fractures with bone visibly protruding through the skin, and he was losing blood at an alarming rate. The bear remained in the vicinity throughout the night. Periodically, it returned to test the tent's structure, clawing at the edges and pressing against it in search of weaknesses. The team took turns maintaining a watch, relying on their dwindling supply of flares to hold the animal at bay. Sleep was impossible, and their food and heat reserves began to run low. Storm conditions made it impossible for aircraft to conduct rescue operations for more than a full day. For over 24 hours, the team remained stranded on a shrinking ice floe with an injured teammate and a persistent predator mere meters away. The bear's continued presence suggested it recognized their isolation and lack of mobility, waiting for another opportunity to strike. By the afternoon of March 16th, the weather cleared enough for helicopters to launch. As the first rescue aircraft neared the camp, the noise from the rotors startled the bear, causing it to retreat across the ice. This brief window allowed the helicopter to land and evacuate the researchers safely. Dr. Novak was transported to a trauma facility where he underwent emergency surgery to repair the extensive damage to his leg. Multiple transfusions were required to stabilize his condition. Although he survived and recovered after several months of intensive therapy, he was left with permanent scarring and some long-term limitations to his mobility. The incident served as a stark reminder of the evolving risks faced by polar researchers. As Arctic ecosystems continue to destabilize, the behavior of apex predators like polar bears becomes increasingly unpredictable. With traditional hunting patterns disrupted, the chances of direct human encounters rise, and even well-trained teams can find themselves unprepared for the consequences. The northern Rocky Mountain wilderness spanned across vast regions of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, covering millions of acres of high-altitude forests, rugged slopes, and geothermal activity. Within these remote backcountry expanses, natural hot springs formed microclimates that attracted both wildlife and human visitors throughout the year. These geothermal sites, while scenic, often became flashpoints for dangerous encounters with large predators. In July 2017, during the height of the summer season, record numbers of people traveled into wilderness zones bordering a well-known protected area. Favorable weather and a surge of interest in backcountry recreation placed additional strain on already limited wildlife monitoring operations. While many visitors were drawn by the promise of solitude and natural beauty, their growing presence in these wild zones increased the likelihood of conflict with territorial animals. Ranger David Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the state's Wildlife Management Service, had been assigned to monitor the area around a popular cluster of geothermal features located approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest ranger station. The region's remoteness demanded that field teams operate with a high degree of autonomy, as emergency response times could easily stretch beyond an hour under the best conditions. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Mitchell had submitted multiple requests for additional patrol support. Reports from hikers, outfitters, and campers described a noticeable rise in bold bear behavior, with several groups needing extraction after close-range encounters. The concern was growing, but personnel shortages made reinforcement difficult. On the morning of July 18th, Mitchell was joined by two less experienced rangers, Christina Walsh and Robert Chen, both in the final stages of their field training. The patrol assignment was routine on paper, covering trail maintenance, campsite inspections, and wildlife tracking, but the team knew the risks associated with summer bear activity. The geothermal zone they were entering was not only popular with hikers, but also served as prime feeding ground for large omnivores due to the thermal-enhanced vegetation and cover. They departed their staging area shortly after 6:30 a.m. Their route would take them through forested corridors lined with willow and spruce, across active thermal areas, and into the more secluded basins known for wildlife sightings. Though armed with bear spray and trained in encounter protocols, the rangers understood that some circumstances allowed little time to react. Unknown to them, a mature female grizzly with 2 cubs had been frequenting the area near the hot springs for several days. Weighing around 250 kilograms, the bear had been observed by backcountry guides, but had not previously shown aggressive behavior. However, as is often the case with maternal animals, her instincts could shift without warning if her cubs or a food source were perceived to be threatened. After roughly 3 hours on the trail, the patrol team entered a narrow corridor bordered by dense willow thickets. The undergrowth in this area was particularly thick, with tight bends and limited sight lines. Blind corners and heavy brush created the ideal conditions for a surprise wildlife encounter. Without any warning, the bear emerged from the undergrowth directly ahead and charged Mitchell, who was leading the group. The attack happened in seconds. Though he instinctively reached for his bear spray, there was no time to deploy it. The bear's momentum drove her into him at full speed, knocking him to the ground with immense force. The initial impact fractured several of Mitchell's ribs. As he lay pinned, the bear began mauling him with claws and powerful bites, targeting his upper chest and neck. It was a swift and overwhelming onslaught, driven not by predatory hunger, but by maternal defense. In the bear's eyes, the rangers had wandered too close. Walsh and Chen, who had been trailing just 10 meters behind, witnessed the ambush. They immediately tried to intervene, raising their voices and firing warning shots into the air, using sidearms meant only for emergency use. The loud noise echoed through the trees, temporarily startling the animal. The bear hesitated only briefly before retreating. She gathered her cubs and disappeared back into the underbrush. The assault had lasted less than a minute, but its effects were devastating. Mitchell had sustained catastrophic injuries. The bear's jaws had crushed his windpipe, and several major blood vessels had been torn. A punctured lung further reduced any hope of recovery. Walsh rushed to his side and began administering first aid. Chen issued an emergency radio call for air evacuation, giving coordinates and requesting immediate medical support. They both worked in unison to manage the wounds and maintain CPR, but the situation was dire. Mitchell never regained consciousness and succumbed to his injuries before the helicopter arrived, nearly 40 minutes later. The incident marked the first fatal bear-related ranger death in the region in more than a decade. In its aftermath, the state's Wildlife Management Agency launched a full review of its patrol procedures in areas known for high bear activity. New regulations were introduced, including minimum team size requirements for remote patrols, closer communication intervals, and mandatory backup when entering zones identified as high risk during certain seasons. Further investigation revealed a critical detail. The bear had been defending a recently killed ungulate carcass located less than 100 meters from the trail. The food source likely elevated her territorial instincts, making her more prone to a defensive attack. Wildlife biologists concluded that the encounter had been non-predatory, triggered instead by the bear's proximity to both cubs and a valuable food cache. Mitchell's colleagues, devastated by the loss, helped establish a memorial fund in his name. The initiative focused on improving ranger safety through advanced training and the development of public education campaigns aimed at reducing human-wildlife conflicts in sensitive areas. Wildlife officials later located the female bear and her cubs using drone surveillance and trail cameras. After careful evaluation of her behavior and the circumstances surrounding the attack, The decision was made to relocate the family unit to a more isolated portion of the backcountry. The choice not to pursue lethal removal underscored the agency's assessment that the bear's actions had been driven by maternal defense rather than unprovoked aggression. Mitchell was remembered by those who knew him as a steady, thoughtful leader with a deep commitment to conservation and education. He had mentored dozens of young rangers over the years and was respected for his calm presence under pressure. His death sent a ripple through the ranger community, sharpening awareness around the unpredictable nature of working in true wilderness. Though the landscape where he died remains wild and unforgiving, the legacy he left behind continues to shape how rangers are trained, equipped, and supported. His passing is a sobering reminder of the risks that come with protecting the front lines of human-wildlife coexistence, and of the need to respect the animals that call these remote places home. The Cascade Mountains of Washington State contained hundreds of pristine waterways that attracted both recreational anglers and the diverse wildlife that depended on these aquatic ecosystems. The region's abundant rainfall and snowmelt created ideal conditions for salmon runs, which in turn supported thriving populations of black bears, the area's most common large predator. In August 2016, late summer brought exceptional fishing conditions to the remote rivers that wound through the state's rugged wilderness. The combination of moderate temperatures and steady water levels provided perfect opportunities for both experienced anglers and casual enthusiasts to enjoy the outdoors. Mark Stevenson, a 32-year-old accountant from Seattle, had organized a weekend fishing trip with 3 of his longtime friends. They had spent months planning the outing, selecting a secluded stretch of river known for its trout populations and relative lack of foot traffic. Joining Mark were Derek Liu, a graphic designer who had fished since childhood; Jessica Parker, a nurse who used outdoor recreation to decompress from work; and Brian Murphy, a construction worker and recent convert to fly fishing. Their chosen destination lay approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Wenatchee, accessible only via a rugged Forest Service road requiring 4-wheel drive vehicles. The river carved its way through dense coniferous forest, forming numerous pools and eddies where trout gathered to feed. The group established base camp on a gravel bar beside the river, setting up their tents in a clearing that allowed for both water access and a buffer from the surrounding brush. They followed best practices for bear safety, storing food in sealed containers and keeping the camp clean. Wildlife officials had long documented rising black bear populations in the area, a result of effective conservation efforts and regulated hunting. The specific stretch of river the group chose was part of a key wildlife corridor used by bears moving between higher elevation feeding zones and lower elevation denning areas. That summer's drought had further complicated bear activity. A poor berry crop forced bears to expand their foraging territory, often lingering longer near water sources to scavenge fish or aquatic vegetation. Trail cameras positioned by researchers recorded an uptick in bear movement along this very river. On their second day of fishing, the group spread out across a 200-meter section of waterway to minimize interference. Mark positioned himself near a fallen tree that had created a natural dam, forming a promising fishing pool teeming with activity. The black bear that would soon disrupt their trip was a mature female, estimated to weigh around 130 kilograms. She had spent several days moving downstream, feeding on fish remains from a recent salmon run and foraging among the thinning vegetation. According to biologists, this bear had been recorded on trail cameras for nearly 2 weeks, following a pattern of temporary feeding stops along the riverbank. Around 2:30 p.m., while wading knee-deep in water near the rocky shore, Mark noticed movement in the dense trees roughly 50 meters upstream. Though he couldn't immediately identify the creature, he sensed it was large. Moments later, the bear stepped from the forest and began moving toward the river. Her posture suggested a focused intent on reaching the water rather than direct aggression toward the fishermen. Yet Mark found himself squarely in her path. He instinctively began backing away slowly, careful not to provoke a reaction. While not an expert in bear behavior, He knew that black bears were typically less aggressive than grizzlies and would often avoid humans when given space. However, the bear's behavior shifted. It became clear she was guarding something nearby, possibly a den or a cached food source the group had unknowingly approached. Her body language changed, signaling heightened stress and defensive instincts. As Mark attempted to sidestep toward deeper water, his foot slipped on the uneven riverbed. He fell backward into the current with a splash, a sudden movement that triggered the bear to charge. She struck him with a forepaw across the chest and arm before he could recover his footing. The force of the impact sent him sprawling in the water, his skin torn by deep claw marks. Though painful, the cold river may have spared him from worse. The bear hesitated at the edge of the deeper current, reluctant to enter the swift water where her footing would be compromised. Mark's shouts had alerted his friends, who began moving toward his location, yelling to create noise. Derek arrived first and began hurling rocks into the water near the bear, which helped divert her attention. Confronted by multiple people and increasing noise, the bear backed away from the river and slipped back into the trees. Jessica, drawing on her medical training, quickly began treating Mark's injuries while Brian and Derek maintained watch. Mark had sustained multiple deep lacerations, but no bones were broken and no arteries were severed. Using a satellite communication device, they contacted rangers to report the bear encounter and request medical assistance. Authorities later confirmed that the bear had likely been defending a nearby den site. Her behavior, while alarming, aligned with defensive rather than predatory instincts. Mark received additional treatment at a regional clinic, where his wounds were cleaned and dressed. He recovered within a few weeks, with only minor scarring to show for the experience. The incident became a pivotal learning moment for the group. It reinforced the importance of situational awareness and understanding local wildlife behaviors, even during seemingly routine activities like fishing. Wildlife managers used the event as a case study for bear safety outreach, developing new materials aimed specifically at recreational anglers. The group was interviewed extensively by researchers studying human-wildlife interaction patterns in the region. Their first-hand observations provided valuable data on how bears respond to unintentional human intrusion during periods of environmental stress. In response, officials increased trail camera coverage and instituted more frequent ranger patrols during peak recreation months. Early warning systems were developed to alert visitors to elevated bear activity in specific zones. For Mark, the experience strengthened his respect for the wild spaces he loved. He began carrying bear spray on every trip and encouraged his peers to undergo basic wildlife safety training. The group continued their annual fishing excursions, but now treated wildlife precautions as an essential part of their routine planning. Proof that even experienced outdoor enthusiasts can always learn more about coexisting with nature.